an appalling spike in violence. Ethnic clashes kill more than 200 people in Sudan's Darfur region as national security forces fail to protect civilians and the government in Khartoum remains unrecognized. Is further turmoil inevitable? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Sudan. Last weekend, Sudan faced some of the worst intercommunal violence it's seen in years. At least 300 people were killed or injured in the city of Geneina in western Darfur. The latest violence erupted after 2 Arab nomads were found dead near Kreinik. That's a town that's home to many ethnic Masalit. Now, it wasn't long before armed Arab tribesmen hit back, raiding the town, killing 9 people.
Violence is increasing in Darfur, and this is the second time in 5 months that the Kreinik town has seen a deadly wave of attacks. The violence is preventing humanitarian aid getting to those in need. OCHA has had to suspend food distribution in West Darfur, affecting at least 62,000 displaced people.
Well, keeping the peace in Darfur has proven very challenging over the past few years. At the end of 2020, UN peacekeepers withdrew from the area when their mandate expired. The responsibility for maintaining peace was then handed over to a national security force, a combination of the police, army, several rebel groups, as well as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. But while they were supposed to work together, many of them are instead competing for control. And the RSF isn't exactly known for law and order. The paramilitary group has been accused of serious abuses, including rape, torture, and kidnapping. Some of the crimes are so horrific, Human Rights Watch labeled the group as men with no mercy.
Rape was just one of their tactics in the systematic violence that happened in the protest square when they were clearing the sit-in. Killing, beating, and rape were all part of the systematic violent assault.
And it's not just Darfur that's seen violence and instability. The situation across Sudan is fragile at best. 6 months ago, the military staged a coup, ousting Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and imposing a state of emergency. The man responsible, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, said he would restore the country's transition to democracy. But many say his move was nothing more than a power grab. Anti-coup protests spread from city to city while security forces cracked down. Hundreds of protesters have been killed, but the demonstrations continue.
We are adamant to overthrow this failed government. We came out with our youth, as you can see, to break our fast together. We have no problem that people stay here in protest and hope that we can form a sit-in that today turns into a sit-in and people do not go back home. I hope so.
So let's assess the state of Sudan. And joining me now from New York is Suliman Baldo. He is the Africa Program Director at the International Center for Transitional Justice. In Washington is Cameron Hudson, the former Chief of Staff to the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. And from Khartoum, Sudanese activist Hamid Murtada. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's begin then with the latest spate of violence in Darfur. Hundreds are known to be dead. The UN is calling it appalling. But Suliman, is anyone surprised that this has happened?
Sadly, not at all. This is just the latest episode in a series of such cycles of violence that affected West Darfur. In December of 2019, January of 2020, there was a similar scenario of fighting in the capital of West Darfur, Geneina. Attacks by Janjaweed and elements of the Rapid Support Forces against thousands of displaced people in Kreinik IDP camps in Geneina, forcing the displacements of thousands to the center of the city. April of 2021, there was a repeat, January of 2021, but again in April of 2021, there was a repeat of this in Geneina, in the area of attacks by pastoralist armed people supported and backed up by elements of the Rapid Support Forces against displaced people and areas in which they settled, either within and around Geneina or in places like Kreinik. And therefore, no one is surprised because of the repetitive nature of these attacks, and there have been no accountability for any of the previous incidents.
Right.
And today, I expect that the government would be any way different from what it has done, which is ignoring the events and brushing them off as just another episode of tribal infighting. It is not.
It is not. But what about the Janjaweed itself? Because many are saying that it is responsible for orchestrating this violence. Is it still behaving, just as it was as a force under under Omar al-Bashir, of course? Is it still that same force that it was from years before?
The Janjaweed is a very generic term. It's basically designating pastoralists who are armed from particular ethnic groups, predominantly of Arab origin. Many of them were recruited under Bashir into the broader Janjaweed militia at the peak of the fighting in 2003, 2004. 2013, the nucleus of the Rapid Support Forces was former fighters of the Janjaweed, headed by the overall commander of the Rapid Support Forces, General Hamid. And therefore, when people say Janjaweed are attacking, they are referring to armed militias of Arab origin among pastoralist herders, camel herders from, in different regions of Darfur. It doesn't say that there is a constituent body of Janjaweed, but it's a general designation of militias that were raised, armed, trained by the Sudanese army to fight on its behalf against Darfur armed movements, and they were left to their own devices, spreading death and desolation across Darfur until today without any intervention from the Sudanese army to contain them.
Right. So Cameron Hudson, was it ever realistic to think that this, coalition of military, paramilitary, law enforcement could ever actually serve a common purpose under the banner of national security forces charged with protecting civilians?
Well, no, I think those of us who've been watching this situation closely for the past few years would suggest that the terms of the Juba peace agreement, the agreement that was overseen by the military in the last 2 years, that was notionally supposed to develop a peace plan, a peace proposal for this region and the other peripheral regions of the country, was never really going to be a serious document for a number of reasons. One, I think, and most importantly, the military and security services are completely unreformed. So to suggest that they are going to move from the aggressors all of a sudden to essentially the peacekeepers, replacing a UN peacekeeping operation that had been deployed to the Darfur region for more than a decade, really stretches the imagination, right? That they were going to be able to step into that role, either from a technical perspective or, frankly, from a willingness perspective, right? I mean, it would have entirely changed the outlook of what the military has been doing in the country for decades. So I think that's a sort of a false flag on the part of the military to suggest that they could do that. But then, secondly, there were a host of funding requirements under the Juba peace agreement that essentially was going to inject massive new inflows of development aid from the state into this region, again, to promote job creation, social welfare, provide services to people who, frankly, have never really received government services before. And that, again, was going to transform the area. And then the last element was the appointment of Mini Manawi as essentially the governor general of the Darfur region. And so acknowledging the armed movements and giving them some kind of leadership role in the country or in the region, which again is one of the principal demands that Darfuris have had going back to the start of their rebellion against the government. And there again, I think you see someone like Mini Manawi very much in the pocket of the military, very much trying to enrich his own life and the lives of those fighters that remain loyal to him. And so I think on every different sort of stroke, there was no real sense that we were going to see any of the claims from this peace agreement implemented in a way that really fundamentally changed the security landscape in the region.
Okay, but Cameron, was it a mistake, if we could describe it as that, was it a mistake for UN peacekeepers to withdraw in 2020, or did they really have no choice, given how much they were, in a sense, resented by a number of communities?
Well, I actually think it's even more complicated than that. It wasn't so much the resentment, because what we've seen from those communities is they actually didn't want the UN to leave. As much as the UN was only partially successful in protecting civilians across this very large swath of territory, they were essentially a bulwark in many respects against these Janjaweed attacks that they'd suffered for so long. What explains, I think, the UN withdrawal, however, was, let's go back to the moment about a year ago when it was being debated. And what we saw was the prime minister, the civilian appointed prime minister, who had the support of the international community, essentially advocating on behalf of the military that the UN should leave, essentially vouching for the military to say, no, we can provide for our own security. Now, he was doing this because he was under pressure from the military to make that claim. And as an international community looking to support the leadership of a civilian prime minister, we went along with that. I think knowing full well that the facts on the ground and the facts within the military had not sufficiently changed to really create the kind of security that the UN was at least trying to provide.
Okay. You know, Hamid, you have said as well that this should not be construed as a tribal conflict. You say it is sponsored by the state, similar to what Suliman was saying. Explain.
It is sponsored by the state in so many ways. For instance, now you see the rapid support forces who are part of the state now. They're part of the de facto government, and they're very much active in the current conflict. But it goes beyond that, not only the direct involvement of rapid support forces, and in some cases, military forces as well. It goes beyond that to the fact that the state, the current de facto government, have been seeing these signs that violent outbreaks in Darfur will continue, and there have been a lot of signs, and they chose to ignore it, and they have not shown any seriousness or interest even in solving these issues. Meanwhile, the solutions are there, and this kind of reminds us that we cannot look at the violence outbreaks in Darfur, whether it was tribal or not, in isolation from the bigger problem, which is the current governance situation, and following the coup of the 25th of October. And we will not be able to have peace in Darfur without solving this political problem currently. And the political problem will not be solved without civilian protection and ensuring civilian oversight over the military institutions in the future. So they're all mutually exclusive, and they go hand in hand, and solving the security problems will require a serious transformation in the government.
So, Hamid, tell us this. I mean, you're on the ground, or at least in Khartoum. We tend to focus a lot in the media on what actually does make the news. How much are we missing? Is it much worse on the ground, and what is not actually being reported?
We are definitely missing a lot, and international media are also missing a lot because of many issues with regards to internet reach and language and so on. However, what's different now is that because of social media, but also because of the existence of resistance committees in these states, in Darfur and all over Sudan, we know more now. We see videos, we see photos, and there are a lot of indicators that the situation now could very much slip into the 2003 scenario in Darfur. But now we know more about it. We see videos and photos and news through resistance committees and through different youth activists. So we are missing a lot, but we definitely see more than we used to see back in 2003 when the conflict was at its
right.
peak.
It's frightening to even hear mention of the slipping back into the 2003 scenario, Hamid, as you just mentioned. But Suliman, let me ask you this. Various groups, activists across Sudan are actually calling for the UN Security Council to take action now. What would that solve? What could the UN Security Council actually do to help quell this escalation in violence and arguably a descent into much worse?
An intervention by the UN Security Council, of course, will underscore the failure of the leaders of the coup d'etat that is setting itself now at the government of the day in Sudan to assume their core responsibility of protecting civilians. And on the contrary, and here I agree with Mr. Murtada, that this is not a tribal conflict. The state and the Sudanese military establishment bear core responsibility of the situation as it deploys today. And we see no sign of political will in the coup regime in addressing the root causes of this problem, which is the militarization of the tribes by the Sudanese military establishment as a way of fighting insurgencies in Darfur and in other regions, and then leaving these militias to their own devices. And until this is reversed and corrected, there will be no peace in Darfur or in any other region of Sudan. And yes, this is therefore a national security problem, and it is a regional and international security problem, because destabilization in Darfur is affected by and is going to affect the situation in the Sahel region and in the North Africa region, particularly Chad and the areas to the north of Darfur region in particular. Therefore, yes, I think this warrants and justifies higher attention from all international instances. I saw today, for example, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for independent investigations, and I think this is also called for and should be done.
Right. I mean, Cameron, if you can speak to that, because so many are saying a huge part of the problem here is that there has never really been accountability for any of the massive crimes against human rights that have been committed over the course of the last 2 decades in Sudan, and this is accumulatively causing greater and greater problems.
Well, it is. I mean, I think what we're seeing right now is the very first trial at the International Criminal Court, going back to the Darfur era of Ali Kushaib. So that trial just recently started. So there is the first, I think, glimmer of what some accountability might look like from that heightened period of violence in the early 2000s. Obviously, there are a number of other very prominent officials, including the former president Omar al-Bashir, whose fate is sort of unknown in terms of whether or not they will stand trial for the crimes that have been committed. But I think we have to look beyond just Darfur, because the violence that we see in Darfur and the militarization or the weaponization of identity and tribe in Darfur is seen really all over the country. It's obviously, I think, most acute right now in Darfur. But we see the military essentially acting as both arsonist and firefighter throughout the country. Let's remember that the economy, since the military took over in its coup d'etat, is in essentially a free fall right now. The political process aimed at restoring civilian rule and restoring a transition to some kind of democratic government, who knows how far into the future, is completely stalled by the military. And so the military, in order to justify its hold on power and its own reason to be there, it has to create these security incidents to justify its reason to say that civilians can't possibly run this country because it's too fraught, it's too contentious, it's too security at risk to allow us to turn it over to a civilian. So it is very much part of their strategy to continue to foment violence and instability across the country to justify their hold on power.
That is horrific to hear. But Cameron, you alluded quickly to the economic issues, and I want to address that with you because those economic challenges, Sudan continues to face in no small part. The cost of living helped actually spark the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir. And if anything now, the economy is even worse off. So will we find the Sudanese actually, against, the wishes of the military, obviously, more inspired than ever to continue their uprising? The military has been able to deliver zero security, much less any progress on the economic front.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think the military has shown how completely inept and incapable they are of managing the economy, number one. And number two, what we've seen is the international community is now no longer willing to continue to finance a military government. And so whether it's their closest allies in the Gulf or whether it's the international financial institutions, Sudan's military has essentially been cut out from any international financing that would keep the economy from bottoming out. And so they really are in very desperate straits right now. We're seeing them, continue to try to use the gold sector and other privileged sectors to support themselves. But none of that makes it into the sort of the general economy or trickle down to the general population. So I think that the failing economy will only continue to put pressure on the military by average Sudanese who are very clearly, not cowed by the military threats, not cowed by the arrests and the killings that continue to happen by the military on pro-democracy protesters. I don't see this movement going away anytime soon.
Okay. Hamid Murtada, I'd like to hear your perspective on that, because as we were saying, we lost you for a second there, but it was the economic challenges that really helped, in large part, spark the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir. They are still there, and they're obviously getting accumulatively worse. Where does that leave the Sudanese people? I mean, how motivated will they be, no matter what the crackdown on protests might amount to? How motivated will they be to continue their pressure on this government?
What we have seen since the Bashir regime and now following the military coup is that, the increased crackdown on protests only motivate people to go out in larger numbers and to continue to demand, for freedom, peace, and justice, and so on. And, what also, a silver lining of this crackdown and so on is that it pushes these revolutionary forces, resistance committees, and youth activists, and so on, to find more innovative ways to kind of push for change rather than only going out for protests and so on. So I think the economic conditions, as they worsen, people would be even more interested in going out. These violence outbreaks in Darfur and in other regions of Sudan will also incentivize people to go out in larger numbers. So I don't see that slowing down. I see it actually getting larger and larger. And, with the period of Ramadan now, things have been a bit slower in terms of protesting and so on. But you can see how there are a lot of plans for after Ramadan, and people are very much still interested in pushing more for their demand.
I mean, so much of what we're hearing, Hamid, is disheartening, but knowing how driven your people are, does it give you a sense of hope?
There is always a sense of hope. And I think as long as we have young people and older people as well fighting in the streets and in different platforms and avenues, there's always hope. You can see that this current coup took place like 6 months ago, but it hasn't been able to move forward. Anything haven't been able to form a civilian government as they claimed. And protests did not stop, not a single day for the past 6 months. So hope remains.
Okay. Suliman, we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to give you some time for your final thoughts.
Yes, the events of Geneina have underscored the underlying tensions in the ruling alliance of the military coup d'etat, in the sense that we are aware of tensions between Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. However, because of their role in the events of Geneina, we have seen a former spokesman for Sudan Armed Forces, also Army, sending clear public messaging that it is time for the Rapid Support Forces to be integrated back into the Sudanese Armed Forces. We have seen Hemeti, the commander of the RSF, and his brother, the operational commander, Abdulrahim Dagalo, absent from the meeting of the National Security Committee that was held urgently to discuss the security situation in Darfur. Out of that meeting, came, the formation, of course, of committees to dilute, the responsibility of the state in really protecting civilians. One for health and humanitarian issues, another to investigate. Let me remind everyone that a similar committee of investigations back for the events of April 2021 had never published its reports, and no one among the 38 people identified, mostly commanders of the Rapid Support Forces in Geneina, who were identified as responsible for fomenting the events then, were ever apprehended and brought to justice. And therefore, the government is going into theatrics to show that it is assuming its responsibility, but nothing would come out of it. And this would add to the deterioration of the situation on the ground. Okay. And it should expose even further the weakness of the coup d'etat that is today claiming to reinforce power in Sudan.
Suliman Baldo, Cameron Hudson, Hamid Murtada, thank all three of you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and of course our viewers as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.